You're listening to the Corbett Report.
Welcome, friends. James Corbett here, CorbettReport.com. Today is the 24th of September, 2014, and today we are talking on the line with Dr. Graeme MacQueen, who I hope some of the more attentive Corbett Report viewers will remember from a video report that was issued via GRTV, but available on CorbettReport.com 2 years ago, talking about 9/11, The Next Step. And at that time, we were introduced to Dr. Graeme MacQueen, who, of course, presented at the 9/11 Revisited Conference in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, with myself back in 2012. And he is, of course, he was a founding director of the Center for Peace Studies at McMaster University, a place where he also taught for 30 years. He is co-editor of the Journal of 9/11 Studies with the esteemed Kevin Ryan, and of course that is at journal-of-911studies.com. I think I did get that right. journal-of-911studies.com. And he is the author of a brand new, highly recommended by myself book, the 2001 Anthrax Deception: The Case for a Domestic Conspiracy. Dr. Graeme MacQueen, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today.
Oh, you're welcome, James. Thanks for having me on.
Excellent. Well, it is good to talk to you once again. As I say, we did get acquainted in Kuala Lumpur, so I do have that bit of personal acquaintance with you, and I do feel that connection. So I was very excited to receive this book. But having said that, and I mean this in no way as a slight to yourself or to academia in general, but when I opened this book, I don't think I was expecting the book that I actually ended up reading, which is to say this was something of an academic, scholarly page-turner. And by that, I mean to compliment you on the lucidity and clarity of your writing and the way that you present the evidence in this book. Obviously, as the title would indicate, this is about the 2001 anthrax attacks in the United States. It is about the case for a domestic conspiracy, but not the lone nut Bruce Ivans that the FBI ultimately concluded was responsible for the attacks, a different type of domestic conspiracy, which we will begin to articulate. But I just want to really commend you for the way that you put this together, the way that it's written. It's very compelling. It's as I say, an academic page turner, and the way that the evidence is laid out is extremely precise and concise. So my hat's off to you for being able to accomplish that.
Thank you, James. Those positive comments from you mean a lot to me. The shows you've done have also been important to me, and I've listened to a lot of them. I guess as far as the book goes, it's not all that big a book, but I think I pack a fair bit in it. I really don't like BS, to be honest, whether it's academic BS or any other kind of BS. I wanted to write a book that was short and to the point. It's not a comprehensive account of the anthrax attacks. It just has a few points that I wanted to try and give evidence for. And one of the points obviously has to do with the linking of the anthrax attacks to the 9/11 attacks, to the point where I really think we should begin talking about them together. We might call it the 9/11 anthrax operation, or we might call it the strategy of tension 2001. There are a variety of things we can call it, but we must put back together what have been separated by the FBI, and that is these two sets of attacks.
Well, I think you're exactly right about that, because it does seem from our perspective today that 9/11 was an event that took place on a singular day, but it is difficult for even those of us who did live through those events in that time period to recall how 9/11 was obviously an ongoing phenomenon that stretched out over those weeks and months in the winding down days of 2001, to the extent that everyone was wondering about the next attack. When was the next attack coming? What form would the next attack take? And that was something that was speculated on to no degree or with much degree of speculation, hype, and seemingly never-ending rhetoric from the mainstream media. And this book does a remarkably good job of recapturing that time frame with extensive documentation to a lot of the newspaper stories and mentions in the media that were happening around that time, specifically regarding the possibility of a biological attack. And lots of these references, as you put into the as you document very thoroughly, as I say in this book, took place in September of 2001, before, according to the FBI, anyone knew that an anthrax attack had taken place other than the perpetrators of the anthrax attacks. So let's talk a little bit about that context of the of September 2001 and how this meme of, as you point out in one of the chapters, the unthinkable suddenly started to become very thinkable.
Yeah, well, it's one of the giveaways, really, for these attacks, which is why I had a separate chapter on foreknowledge of the attacks. I guess I call it advanced knowledge, but whatever you call it, the basic fact here is that the newspapers, and not just newspapers, other media, were filled with references to not just the danger of coming attacks. I'm talking about the period right after 9/11. But quite specifically, the dangers of biological and chemical attacks. And they sometimes got quite specific. I mean, this is during September. They're talking about a run on Cipro, which is the antibiotic people were taking at the time for anthrax. That run on Cipro happened well before there was any public knowledge of the anthrax attacks. It was reported in the New York Times. The Washington Post was talking about people begging for people wanting a vaccine for anthrax. There were all kinds of references, quite specific, some of them talking about the fact that, for example, on September 17th in the Washington Post, there was an article about, it'd be really terrible if somebody were to attack with anthrax because, people would get the disease, but it wouldn't be diagnosed right away, so it would be this covert, horrible thing. And on the exact day that showed up in the Washington Post, namely September 17th, possibly the day after, September 18th, actual letters with anthrax spores were being put in the mail. And just as the guy had predicted, people started to get anthrax, and they didn't initially diagnose it because people didn't know what it was. They had so-called flu-like symptoms. And as we look into this advanced knowledge thing, we find that, Mr. Bush, the president, so-called, I don't like to call him the president because I don't believe he was ever elected. And I think it's actually an insult to the American population to refer to this pretender as the president. But in any case, a man occupying the White House, George W. Bush, was put on this antibiotic, Cipro, on 9/11, and so was the vice president, Mr. Cheney. And there are a whole set of quite specific incidents that are discussed in that advanced knowledge chapter that are fishy in the extreme. Now, at the time, people seemed to accept it. Oh, well, this was just a worry. It was just a threat. We won't call it advanced knowledge because, of course, it doesn't become clear that it's advanced knowledge until the attacks become known. And also there was this idea going around that, this is coming from our intelligence agencies and they have reason to believe that such attacks might happen. This is evidence-based. We should be grateful for these warnings. But we can see now in retrospect that it wasn't based on good intelligence, that the see, by the time they launched this case, it's accepted that this was a domestic operation and that the spores came from inside the U.S. military-industrial complex. So the Stevens family says, well, I'm sorry, but this is outrageous that the security should be so lax in these laboratories that somebody can go in there and either steal anthrax that's already been prepared or, sit down and create their own anthrax, their own spores, and then take it out and kill Mr. Stevens and the other people. That's not acceptable. And so that's what they do, basically, is work on that basis, that this shows incaution, it shows sloppiness,
negligence.
It shows Sorry?
Negligence.
Negligence, that's the word. Anyway, so they launched a case, and, well, who is it that in the Department of Justice that has the job of taking them on, contending against them? Well, it's not the FBI, it's not the criminal division, it's not even the lawyers in the criminal division of the DOJ, because this isn't a criminal case, it's a civil case. So it's a whole different set of lawyers in the DOJ that have to deal with this. And if they were to accept the FBI's conclusion that Ivins did this, well, Ivins was, of course, in a U.S. military lab at USAMRIID in Fort Detrick. And that would mean that the Stevens family's right. That he either took anthrax from there or that he prepared his own there. And their job is to argue against that. So they actually create a great deal of distance in their arguments between Bruce Ivins and the anthrax that was sent in the letters. They don't say outright, we don't think Bruce Ivins did it, but their whole statement tends very strongly in that direction. They say, look, the stuff used in the envelopes was a highly prepared weapon. They call it a weapon, which the FBI, wanted to avoid. It's not just naturally occurring anthrax. It had to be dried, it had to be prepared in all these ways. The machinery, the equipment at USAMRIID, where Ivins worked, did not have the right equipment, the appropriate equipment to do this. And the skill set was not there. And so this shows, they're actually creating distance between the Ivins narrative and what really happened. And I find that their document is far better argued and takes into consideration the actual scientific evidence that we have than the FBI's, 90 or whatever page document against Ivins. It's really a broadside against the FBI's case, whether consciously or not. And so naturally, even though by this time Ivins was dead, Ivins' former lawyer, Paul Kemp, says, well, this just shows my client didn't do it, and a lot of people are astonished. The Department of Justice itself seems to kind of freak out. There's an internal conflict. There's supposedly shouting matches in the hall. And the civil lawyers get told in no uncertain terms, they get scolded, according to the newspaper articles, and they get told to really back off and settle this case as quickly as possible, out of court. And so they do, and there's a certain amount of money involved. I don't remember, $1 or $2 million that the Stevens family gets with no admission of guilt from the U.S. government. So this is a fascinating example of a conflict that takes place within a United States department from contending groups. And it would, if a person really were to sort out what happened and who commanded whom, they could quite possibly solve the case and figure out who the perpetrators were.
But if the forensic evidence is the one side of the evidence, then the other side is the evidence that leads us to conclude that there was certainly a group of people who were working on putting forward that the the terror, the fear, the propaganda campaign that, as we indicated, stretched back into September before these attacks were even supposedly known by anyone. So let's talk about that evidence, the evidence that points to the fact that there was a group of people who were, at least in ideological terms, on the side of the neocons who were in power in the Bush administration at that time. And tell us what we can derive about the nature of this group and the way that they were acting.
Hard to know how best to get into this, but let's get into it by looking at the attempt to get the Patriot Act passed, because that really is one of the best ways in. So September 17th, I believe it is, John Ashcroft, head of the Department of Justice, says, we are going to be presenting, or I am going to be presenting to Congress very shortly, an anti-terrorism bill, which is very important for the security of Americans, and I'd like to see it passed by the end of the week. So that basically he ends up presenting this bill, which becomes known later as the Patriot Act, on a Wednesday, and wants Congress to approve it and by Friday, within a couple of days, which, obviously you wouldn't have time to read it, study it, or anything. So right away, this is extremely fishy. This is not how bills get passed through Congress. And remember, it has to get passed both through the House of Representatives and the Senate. And the Senate in particular has this reputation of being, sort of the group of wise elders that are supposed to take their time and pass this through various committees, including, for example, the Senate Judicial Committee, which has to examine all legislation that may have an impact on the civil rights of Americans. And Patrick Leahy was the chair of that committee. So here's Ashcroft. Now, the gist is this. From that day, September 17th, until October 26th, when the Patriot Act was signed into law, there was constant pressure from the what I call the executive branch of government, which includes not just the president and the vice president, but all these agencies, the Department of Justice, the Pentagon, the CIA, the FBI, pressure on the legislative branch, on Congress, to pass this act. And so, for example, we have a whole bunch of these guys coming out of the woodwork on about September 30th. You have Minister of Health, or at least that's what he's called in Canada. I forget what he's called in the United States. And we have Rumsfeld, Department of Defense, and we have about five of them come out and give these talks saying, you have to pass this thing quickly, this Patriot Act. And if you don't, something horrible is going to happen. And several of them say quite explicitly, we're worried about biological or chemical attacks. Now, you have to remember, nobody's gotten sick from anthrax at this point, September 30th. That's not going to happen for a few days. But the letters are, in fact, in circulation by this point. In fact, I have to correct what I said. There are people getting sick from cutaneous anthrax by this time at various news agencies, but nobody knows about it. It hasn't been diagnosed yet. So at the very moment the letters are circulating, people are starting to get sick. Nobody's supposed to know about it. These folks in government are coming out and saying, my gosh, you may be attacked with biological weapons soon if we don't pass the Patriot Act. And then this goes, just step by step, all until the time it's passed. We have members of Congress being scared. They're told they're not supposed to identify themselves in public because it could be these WMD attacks. They shouldn't wear the congressional pins. They shouldn't use their congressional license plates. There's barricades around Congress and tape and, this crime scene tape and all kinds of stuff. And so, in other words, they're being constantly threatened and frightened. And then the FBI comes out and says, we've got this very concrete warning, the most serious warning since 9/11. I seem to remember this is October 11th. I may be wrong. And it looks like, my God, there may be a terrible attack within the next couple of days. It may involve, biological or chemical weapons. And so that evening, the Senate passes the Patriot Act. Now, this is a first draft of it. It has to be redrafted, but that's a crucial date, right after the FBI warning. So again, if you look at it closely, which I try to do in the book, it's very clear that there is a group of people in the executive branch of government that are coming out and trying to get that darn bill passed. And why are they trying so quickly, so hard? Well, it's partly because we have evidence that, yes, people can be frightened into restricting their own civil rights, into committing civic self-immolation, and in going to war. This can be done. We know this. That's what the strategy of tension is all about. And in addition to these members of the executive branch, I begin to talk about neocons because this is a somewhat different issue, but it's related, and that is the very, very clear determination to frame the 9/11 event as an act of war, and to say that the United States government must respond with war. That's sufficiently important that I really devoted a chapter to it, because the 9/11 attack. I mean, I was working for the Center for Peace Studies at McMaster University at the time, and we put out a statement which I helped to draft, saying the 9/11 attack should be understood as a crime, not as an act of war. And it's very natural that it should have been understood as a crime. So there's this campaign, and it includes people from the executive branch of government, but a wide variety of other prominent neoconservatives who aren't working for government, writing in the newspapers and so on, starting on the day itself, 9/11, starting on CNN and so on, saying, this was an act of war. This must be understood as an act of war. Don't deal with this through legislation. Don't deal with this through law. This is not a crime. This is war. This is when we rain down destruction on people. This is when we destroy things. This is the America that must now come into being. This is the America that hit Hiroshima. This is the America that destroyed, Berlin. That's what we want to see now. I mean, I'm not making this up. This is said quite explicitly by a wide variety of people in the newspapers and on TV in the wake of the 9/11 attacks. And what I try to show is that all the stuff that comes after that, not just the invasions, Afghanistan, Iraq, and then, of course, we have a whole series of other countries. It continues. It's now Syria. All of this depended upon defining the 9/11 attacks as an act of war. If they're an act of war, then the president is the commander-in-chief. He gets to have certain powers, and they use that very consciously when they set up these fraudulent tribunals to try people in the world on the war on terror. They used it in NSA, Patriot Act, that whole thing. All the restriction of American civil rights that came after 9/11 depended upon this defining of the events as an act of war. And I'm quite sure this was planned. When you have all these people coming out singing the same tune on 9/11 and in the days right after it, with very predictable results. So this, I think, that's why I very consciously used the word conspiracy in the title of the book. I understand the way that people like you and me are called conspiracy theorists and how we're ridiculed for it. I understand that, but I don't think we should run away from that. I think we should say you have to have a concept of conspiracy, hopefully a sophisticated concept, but a concept, because that's what this was. This was a plan made by a group of people in secret to commit illegal and immoral acts. That's what a conspiracy is. So let's call it what it is. So we have, in other words, executive branch, but also a much wider group of neoconservative supporters who are acting in a particular way to create certain results in the fall of 2001 and later. Whether we call this a coup or whatever, it's certainly a real, it's a blow to the civil rights of Americans. It's a blow to democracy. It's a blow to the legislative branch, and it helps to create what some people clearly want, which is a plutocracy the rule of the wealthy in the United States in place of a democracy. And I'm afraid we've gone very far down that road now.
I'm afraid that you're correct in that, and I'm afraid that we've also gone very far down the road in terms of our conversation. So in the interests of time, perhaps we will skip through the very interesting chapter that you have on the hijacker connection to get to some of the implications of the conclusions that we can draw from all of this evidence, which is that this seems to have been some sort of failed or not completely successful false flag event. Because the interesting part of this, obviously, the conclusion that this book arrives at is vastly different than that the FBI arrives at, that this was the work of Dr. Bruce Ivins alone. And from that, we can obviously conclude that there was a group of people that were involved in this, that it was people who were intimately connected with the apparatus of the U.S. government and obviously advocating for the policies being advocated by the administration, etc. But the interesting part about this is that there were many. If this was intended, for example, to be blamed on Iraq, and if this were intended to be used as justification for an invasion of Iraq, it was certainly a failure in that regard because the evidence didn't seem to line up. Ultimately, it kind of collapsed. It came back to the point where this clearly originated from within the U.S. government's own bioweapons program, and eventually it had to devolve into the sort of lone nut scenario that is, I think, the invariable fallback for these types of operations. So yes. It certainly did accomplish certain things, as we've talked about. It did further the war mentality at the time. It did further the fear and amplify the fear from 9/11, and it did result in the passage of the Patriot Act, or at least help in that passage. So it did have its successes, but it had its failures. To what would you attribute those failures and the inability, apparently, of these conspirators to plant the type of evidence that would have seen them succeed in those further aims?
Well, I don't have a very good specific answer to that. I can't do much better than what you've just said, that somehow, and I don't know why, but somehow the conspirators failed to maintain complete control over the investigation. And especially they failed quite early to gain complete control over the examination of the anthrax spores. They tried hard in the newspaper to come up with all kinds of propaganda about how these spores, for example, were weaponized with the addition of bentonite. It's kind of clay, and only Iraq uses bentonite. Oh, so it's got the signature of Iraq, and in various other respects, they fought a hard battle through October and November to try and blame it on Iraq, but ultimately they failed because there were scientists looking at this stuff who apparently were not bought out, who apparently were not brought in on the conspiracy. And this includes some people within the U.S. military and intelligence community, like the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology, which examined the spores and said, there's no bentonite here, right? So I guess the lesson would be, if you're going to try and put one over on people, you better make sure you've got all your allies lined up, because they didn't do it. They blew it that way quite quickly. And sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, or get your hands on some bentonite and make it appear. Yeah.
Right, exactly.
Well, as you say, I guess we certainly don't have the answers to that, because we don't have the answer as to being able to identify by name the people who perpetrated these attacks. But obviously we have a pretty good comprehensive picture of the types of people who would have been involved in this. And obviously it's broadly along the lines of what I think many people in the 9/11 Truth Movement would have suspected and have probably argued all along. Again, I just want to stress that this book really does cover all of the subjects that we just discussed and more in a great degree of detail in a remarkably concise manner. So once again, my hat's off to you for being able to accomplish that. And I wanted to give you the chance to direct people to the best place that they can go to actually purchase this book, because I know obviously Amazon.com will have this in stock, but if there is a more direct way that people can purchase that, let them know.
Thank you, James. Well, the most reliable way so far seems to be for people to go to the website of the publisher. It's Clarity Press. If you Google Clarity Press and you look on recent books that have been published, you'll find the 2001 Anthrax Deception. Click on that, and it has its own web page from which you can order. That's the best way to do it.
Excellent. Well, that link will be in the show notes for this interview, and so there will be a direct way for people to purchase this book. I give my 100% wholehearted recommendation towards it. Once again, my thanks to you for putting this together. I think it is the best slim companion that people can take in their pocket or anywhere they want to guide them through this anthrax deception, as you term it. Graeme MacQueen, thank you again so much for your time today.
Thank you, James. I hope we can talk again soon.